Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Michael Pelage. I'm a Chief Trust Officer at Info Networks, and joining me this afternoon is Justin Macy, who is the Director of Innovation at the National Association of Board of Pharmacies, and Mark Karhoff, who is the founder and principal consultant at 10 Count Consulting. And what we are going to be discussing for the next 50 minutes is the DCSCA, or the Drug Security Supply Chain Safety Act, Security Act. And this is very important. This is actually a piece of federal legislation that was passed over 10 years ago, and has just been implemented within the last 12 months, and will go into full effect later this year. Mark will be walking through this. So one of the things that is, I think, very important here is there are over 4.5 billion prescriptions that are issued each year. And when I first started working with NABP a couple of years ago, and the issue of counterfeits came up, I thought this should only be a concern of people who do this in connection with fake pharmacies or suspect products. But one of the things that you're going to hear today is that this actually is a much broader problem and actually impacts everyone. So one of the first slides here that I want to show is a couple of years ago, Gilead, who are the manufacturers for Tarvi, which is an HIV prescription drug. There was an incident where over $250 million of pharmaceutical products were actually distributed through over 600 pharmacies across 35 states. And one of the things that I was discussing with Justin last night is, particularly with HIV medications, the importance of getting these on a regular basis is critically important to the health of the patient. And what you see here on the slide, and Mark will talk about this later on, is you actually see a legitimate product bottle that had a GS1 data matrix that was actually recycled. And in this situation, which was fortunate for the patients, there was actually rocks and pebbles in the bottle that made it sound like it was legitimate. As I was saying, when you actually have fake product, that is where the patient's life is at risk here. And again, this is something that happened across 35 different states. For those Ozempic and other diabetic products that have had other beneficial use products for weight loss, this has been a topic of conversation in Saturday Night Live, and those that watch South Park, it was actually a topic of a South Park episode that was released on Friday. So this has become very mainstream. Because this particular drug is in such high demand, and there is a supply product, sadly, criminal elements have decided to capitalize upon this. And there have been a number of instances of this particular product making its way through the pharma supply chain, in which some people have become very ill. The last thing that I want to talk about here is this is a picture that I came across when I was doing a hackathon in Geneva at the UN on the pharma supply chain. Someone from GS1 said, "Mike, what do you think of this picture?" And I looked at it and I'm like, "What is that?" So let me help you out. That is a concrete mixer. And what you will notice in that concrete mixer is it has a certain blue dye. So I will let your imagine reach what pharmaceutical catering to an elderly male demographic was being produced at this particular facility. So what happens here is this is a problem that, as I said, the next two speakers, I'm going to be turning over right now to Mark. Mark has over 15 years in the pharma supply chain, in the pharmaceutical industry, and over 25 years in the broader supply chain. And Mark is going to walk through the specifics of the DCSCA, the act or the regulation, and how it impacts the global pharma supply chain. Mark?
All right. So work. Yep. Thanks, everybody. So this is a Drug Supply Chain Security Act. So I think the important thing about this is, Identity, I'm learning a lot about identity this week. I don't know a lot of digital identity stuff. I'm a supply chain guy. But I think the important thing here is to talk about the business drivers, right? Like, why do you need digital identity? What are the things that the business is concerned with? How do you, protect confidential information and some of those things? So this law, basically called the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, was passed in 2013. It was one of the only laws passed that year that was not naming a building. So yay, Congress. We did get a law that passed. It's rolled out over 10 years, and essentially what it does is sets a framework for being able to gather transactional data related to the ownership change of products. So some people have called this track and trace or pedigree. It's not quite that. It's really keeping a record of who owned a particular serial number, which is on a saleable unit of a pharmaceutical product. So it may be a bottle. It might, more likely it's going to be like an outer box of a product. The interesting thing is that the law requires everybody to have a secure, interoperable network or system of systems, but it doesn't define how that's going to happen. And FDA was responsible for issuing guidances, and their guidances have sort of gone a little bit further, but they really haven't answered any of the technical challenges or questions. Their thought has kind of been, well, this law was set up for the industry to kind of work together to figure it out. So we kind of had this vacuum that was created. As you go down the line, the law actually specifically says the FDA cannot name a single system. And that was done for different reasons. There was a lot of back and forth, but basically the industry did not want this to turn into like an overarching sort of governing system around pharmaceuticals, and to have every entity control their own data, but then be ready to share it when it's needed. So FDA can't create a single system. There's other entities like the DEA, who you might be familiar with for controlled substances. They have a lot of requirements and systems for tracking things like opioids, but that is not usable here because DEA has limitations on how their numbers and such can be used. So there's no real area where DEA could help. You also have state entities that are involved that we'll talk about, the State Board of Pharmacies and regulators that are more focused on the pharmacies and the distributors and don't know the manufacturers as well. So you sort of have this fragmented supply chain that this law was released into. And it was meant to supersede. There was basically, because of those incidents that Michael pointed out, there was like a series of things happening where states were passing laws to try to control it. And this law essentially allowed it to supersede all those, and basically said that the federal government now has authority with this law to be able to work with the states to enforce it. I won't go into all the details here, but just to kind of give you an idea, it's a rolling law. So it started back in 2015. There were some requirements around tracking what's called lot level. So like a batch of a drug, which is like a bulk production run of a drug. So think of it as like a truckload maybe of a drug. That's how it kind of started, and paper tracking was kind of the first thing. And then as it's unfolded, it's then moved to the actual saleable unit where the manufacturers are required to put a 2D data matrix barcode on every saleable unit with a unique serial number. So there's a unique serial number. There's also an expiry date. There's something called a G10, which is like a product number, and then a batch number, a lot number. And that unfolds. And the last part actually came out in 2023 was when the whole interoperable system was supposed to be ready. But unfortunately, because of COVID, everything else had been happening in the industry, especially on the pharmacy side, there was a lack of readiness. So that was really kind of delayed. And right now there's a thing called a stabilization period where the FDA is given this year for everybody to kind of get their act together, so to speak. In terms of requirements, so when you think about the pharmacy, there's I think of it as really two big things that they have to do. They have to do a lot of different things, but two really big things. They have to only work with authorized trading partners, and that's required of every entity in the law. So whether I'm a manufacturer, a distributor, or a pharmacy, I'm only supposed to work with an authorized trading partner. And there's definitions around what that is. So it's like I'm licensed with either the state or I'm registered federally, depending on what's required for my role. And it's more about what I'm doing. So, for example, there's big distributors that actually do multiple roles. So they have some private lines that they package, they distribute, and then sometimes they actually do mail pharmacies and mail order pharmacies. So whatever your role is, there are requirements they have to do for each role. I guess the other key thing here is around the identification. So when the product comes in right now, they're required to make sure everything is serialized that's coming in. And if it's not, to be able to ask, why is this not serialized? There are exemptions, some reasons why they can't do it, but by and large, most stuff coming in should now have a 2D barcode. So most pharmacies are familiar with that. And then just to give a little bit of a visual, Justin will talk a little bit about this, but what the supply chain looks like. This is just kind of a generic look around how product moves through the supply chain. So you see the 4 circles there represent kind of some key roles. So you have a manufacturer, a distributor, and then a pharmacy or dispenser, and then you have a patient. The law really only goes up to the point of the pharmacy. So it basically says, make sure that safe product makes it to the pharmacy, and then the pharmacist will control it from there and make sure that it's properly dispensed and everything. So that's really kind of how far the law goes. It's also like it's the responsibilities are sort of decentralized. So if I'm a manufacturer, I have responsibilities where I need to put a barcode on every box. I need to create data related to that. So to be able to send to my next recipient, the distributor, and say, hey, I'm sending you these 1,000 serial numbers that are coming on this truck. Distributor then has a responsibility to take that data and make sure it matches the product coming in. And that kind of continues through the whole supply chain. So there's this sort of, almost like a breadcrumb trail that kind of happens where you pass the data and then the product goes with it. And one becomes kind of a key for the other in terms of making sure the serial numbers I get match the product. One of the biggest challenges with this is there are responsibilities that I have to interact with indirect partners or secondary partners. So now if I'm a manufacturer, you see here in the picture, I've got a dispenser. I don't have a business relationship with that pharmacy. I have a relationship with a distributor. So that might be like a McKesson. I only sell to McKesson. McKesson sells out to all these pharmacies in America. But there's a responsibility for me as a manufacturer to respond if there's a request, like there's a suspicious product. I have a responsibility to respond to a pharmacy to say, those data elements that are in that barcode, those match ones that I produced. So that's called a verification. So I can verify the data in the barcode matches something the manufacturer has on record. I also have to be able to do what's called a product trace, which is I want to see the previous owners of that product. So kind of see that black line in here to see, who was the previous owners of it. So the challenge with that is, as a manufacturer, I have to respond to trading partners I don't have relationships with. I also have to respond to state and federal regulators, so state or federal agents. That can be things like boards of pharmacies or the FDA. It can also be things like state police force, or DEA or FBI. So there's also sort of criminal investigations. So all those things have created this sort of environment where there's a lot of new transactions that need to happen, but there's no relationships established. And I'd say that's really the crux of the problem here, is that there's a lot of new relationships. The other big thing is the data is exponential compared to historically. So today there's something like 200,000 lots, and this number varies, but generally they're saying there's about 200,000 lots or batches in the supply chain in a year. So if you think about all the prescription drugs that are distributed, every drug is made in a batch in a sort of a group of product together. There are 200,000 times that those batches are done on average, on an average year. That's the level that's tracked today, is primarily lot. When we move to the serial level, we actually need to keep track of every single unit in that lot. So now every box of bottles. And there's been some rough sort of math to this. You have about 4.5 billion units that are shipped annually. That number also can fluctuate. There can be 2, sometimes more transactions per unit. So I keep track of, hey, I received this product, I shipped this product. So those are 2 transactions I have to keep track of. I bought it and I sold it. Also, if I consolidated it with another case or things like that. And then I have to keep it for 6 years. So there's a requirement in the law that I have to keep that data for 6 years so that if there's an investigation, it can be pulled all back up again later. And so roughly the industry's been estimating that there's over 1 billion transaction records that need to be stored a year across an industry that historically has had trouble tracking 200,000 transactions a year. 100 billion, I'm sorry, 100 billion, thank you. Yeah. And I know if you multiply it out here, the math doesn't work. So I thought in a room of technical and scientist people, that would be the first thing that'd be pointed out is that the math doesn't work. I also thought throwing in a Star Trek thing would help too. But if you're familiar with that episode, that's I think Trouble with Trebles or something like that, right? But it's a lot of data. And then just to kind of summarize, so we've got a lot of challenges, but the biggest thing is this identity problem, right? It's really like who is legitimate in this supply chain and who can I trust, right? And then I have to interact with people that I don't know. And we have regulators and all these other different roles in the supply chain of entities that need to interact. And how does all this happen? And I guess a final thing before I hand it over to Justin is this has been in the works for a long time now, for almost 10 years or over 10 years. The industry has tried different things. They've tried blockchain. They've had single solution providers try to do things. And essentially what always happens is there's an element of neutrality that's always been in governance that's been missing. So Justin will come up and kind of talk about really how NABP was unique in this situation to try to help to start to create that. So I guess I'll pass it off to Justin.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. So yes, my name is Justin. I'm with the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy. We are not a regulatory body, but our members are. So to give you context here, this is kind of a quick snapshot of how we interact in general with the supply chain. We've talked a lot about DCSCA, the federal statute that's implementing and causing a lot of these things. You'll notice on the bottom left here, you've got two different colors for essentially who are the regulators for members of the supply chain. On the left, you'll see there's teal, that's the federal regulators, and you'll see it moves over to a gentle plum on the right-hand side, that's the state regulators. Our role within NAAP is to be a nonprofit organization that represents the state regulators. We don't represent pharmacies, we don't represent pharmacists, we don't represent pharmaceutical manufacturers. Our job is to represent and help any way we can the actual regulators of pharmacy practice and the supply chain from the state side. And as you can see, most of the interactions as either patients or caregivers we're going to experience are going to happen on that side that's regulated by the state. NAP as a nonprofit is 120 years old. We were started in 1904, and pretty much the goal was if there's something that you're going to have a whole bunch of states do that's the same thing, you should have them do the same thing, right? Right. So for example, in the U.S., the drugs are the same in every state. So if we're going to ask questions about, hey, is this a drug? Can you take these things together? And we're going to test somebody on it. Well, the test should be the same in every state. So we write the test for pharmacists to become pharmacists in the U.S. Basic things like that. Any type of transfer from licensure from one state to another. We do a collection of inspections and stuff like that on behalf of boards and on behalf of the regulated entities. And ultimately, about 2.5 years ago or so, thereabouts, we had some state regulators reach out and say, hey, there's this federal law. We don't really know much about it because it's federal and we're states. Could you help us, right? So we write the Model Act for pharmacy practice in most states. Many states adopt portions of it. So then we started researching it and getting into it and figured out, okay, this is a little harder than it looks on the outset. You have a federal regulator who hasn't really said much about it. Most of the work that's started has happened here from the manufacturer side and less to and some of it to the distributor side, but not really trickled all the way down to the dispenser yet. And just as a show of hands, how many people represent a trading partner in the drug supply chain? Okay, Walmart? I saw it, yeah. Was that? Kroger? Okay, perfect. Anybody else? Wegmans. Okay, perfect. So I'm not sure if you guys work in the DSCSA side. It's okay if you don't, no worries. But generally speaking, this gives you an idea of what's going on there. Most of the scenarios, 3 dispensers here. You have teams that are invested in it. I know because I talked to them. So this is a problem that's being solved. But we started off, and ultimately the state regulators were like, what do we do? How do we get in touch with this? So we actually did a really low-tech pilot because we like to keep things as low-tech as possible as being a 120-year-old nonprofit. You wouldn't think of us as being like the tech forefront of the world. So what we did is we actually made Mark over here politely make just a bunch of phony transactions. And then we sent them to a collection of, and then we got a bunch of pilot test parties for us, and we sent them all to that parts of them, just the ones they would see as test transactions, via Excel. And then we got state regulators and just told them to email people. Just here's a list of contacts. Here's a question. Go ahead and ask them. Try to put the breadcrumb trail back together. The data's all decentralized. It's all federated across. So just put it back together. Because right now, when the state regulator walks into a pharmacy, they go in and say, "Oh, can you give me the transaction history?" And then the pharmacist says, yes, I have it in this thing over here. And they open a thing and they take it out, right? And they hand the piece of paper and it says all the people who previously owned it. Or it says, I don't need to do that because I bought it directly from the manufacturer, right? Those are the kind of big statements that exist. But come November of 2023, that went away. And ultimately what was replacing it is instead you go fish. You go ask every single person that you think might have it for whatever reason, and they give you their transactions, and now you get to go and make your own breadcrumb trail. So the state regulators are obviously like that. That makes it harder for us to do investigations. Could you help us? And many of the dispensers and distributors, mostly distributors, quite frankly, came to us and said, hey, could you prevent us from getting 54 different flavors of requests that we have to respond to within 24 hours, right? Without any defined endpoint to send them to yet. So that's the problem, right? And we got everybody together, and I know Walmart participated in it. I think Kroger was an observer. Wegmans, I believe, was an observer. I think there's a couple hundred people, maybe 100 people, organizations that are all observers to this pilot at this point in the studies that we did on it. And said, okay, what's step one? They said, well, it's really hard to do it if you don't know where to send the message or the request, right? So that's what we started with. So doing that and kind of walking through it, these are our guiding principles. This is when we started getting into DCSCA. This is what we're going to index on, right? So obviously we are a patient safety-driven organization, right? Public health is our mission, supporting the state regulators and achieving that. So first and foremost, kind of an obvious statement. The next one, supporting communication between trading partners and regulators. Regulators are going to ask questions. Trading partners are going to respond. How do we make that as seamless as possible? And likewise, there's trading partner to trading partner communication, right? You have a scenario where you have a small pharmacy in the middle of Kansas and they need to contact Pfizer. How does that happen? Who do they call? What happens at that level, right? Larger chains are going to centralize a lot of their DCSCA operations, but the smaller ones, not so much. They don't necessarily know how to tackle that. The third component here, which is making compliance easier. One of the things that we haven't talked a lot about, and for the dispensers in the room, I'm sure they will back me up on this, is that pharmacies don't really have an easy increase my price of the drugs button, right? They're heavily negotiated with the payers through the insurance carriers and things like that, PBMs for those in the weeds on it. So they don't have necessarily the ability to say, oh, there's new regulation on me, make my product more expensive, right? And so they don't have a way to cover that cost. So the elasticity of the solution has to be very, very low, right? It's very price conscious. There's not an ability to come in and put a whole bunch of technology. And anytime you think about this, I think it's crucially important when you're thinking about dispensers to remember their primary method for communicating with prescribers is via fax machine and phones, right? 100% that is the technology. So if you're coming in and you want to do something else new to have a dispenser talk to a manufacturer, you got to start with a fax machine, right? That's your baseline. If you're doing something else beyond that, you've got friction, and there's no money to pay for it necessarily. Lastly, we want to be technologically agnostic. Our goal is not to come in and say this is the way or what solution exists or things like that, which means we treat everybody kind of in the same kind of broad approach, because that neutrality is often what has been failing in previous attempts to solve some of these problems over the last 10 years before we got involved. And as you can see on the bottom here, we look at this as a system of systems. Everybody's got their own components to these things. But if you have a dispenser at the last mile who doesn't have the tools to actually do their end of it, well, who's check? It's really hard to check once it's left that system, right? Once it's gone from manufacturer, dispenser, manufacturer, distributor, dispenser, it's really, really hard to go through and say who's checking the dispenser in that case. The reality is patients and regulators, right? That's ultimately kind of what happens there in that system in the last mile. So we created Pulse, and before I move on, I'm going to show a quick clip here of other people telling you how amazing it is.
I think what's amazing about Pulse is I think what NABP did is they took a lot of theoretical discussions how we should do this one, and they quickly put together a product called Pulse, right? What Pulse does is it's a catalyst. It gives people a chance to see how the system's supposed to work, and you can actually provide feedback.
I think just having NABP be a leader in developing a solution and having the vision to bring it to a reality, frankly, and then also being open to feedback.
As of right now, I think NABP has really been leading the efforts that as far as understanding what DCSCA means, so that compliance means, and really what the expectations are will be moving forward.
Everything that we're doing for DCSCA is new. The opportunities that are being provided are really nice, and it's something that's exciting to see that can work.
Okay, so I guess we should talk about what Pulse is. So first and foremost, it's a trusted ecosystem, right? It's a platform, and the idea is we took all of our members' data, so the state licenses for wholesalers, dispensers, 3PLs, and we pooled it all together. We did a big data harmonization effort, so if you have a license in all 50 states for a facility, congratulations. We put them all together. We clumped them up. That's hard because the states don't necessarily have great data. I can say that because they're my members, and I'm okay with that. But that's an issue. From there, we then took other unique business identifiers that are used in the industry. So NCPDP numbers, DEA numbers, GLNs. For the dispensers in the room, GLNs are a problem. You either know about that or you don't, but if you do, it is a big problem. And we bundled all those things together, and we'll continue bundling different identifiers that exist. And we did this primarily at the facility level across the board. And in doing so, it then gave us kind of like, if you think about Facebook, a Facebook profile that then could be claimed by a dispenser. Importantly, I will talk about the few things that in Pulse cost money. Claiming a profile, being in it, using it, none of those things cost money for anyone. From there, we allow a user to come in and claim it, and I'll show you a demo of it in a second. We allow a user to come in and claim that profile, and we'll walk through how we identity validate that. Once they've claimed it, they can add contact information. When I say contact information, I mean emails, phone numbers, and names, right? It's really Mickey Mouse at this point because we are catering to the lowest common denominator from a technological stack. Those things will eventually become API endpoints or calls that we'll go ahead and publish, and so you could have a scenario where a regulator could contact you potentially through Pulse, use an API, ping to you, and have it routed to your system automatically in a standardized format. But today, it's where you want the regulator to send that email that for dispensers, they have 2 days to respond to, and for everybody else, they have 1 day to respond to. Likewise, this is flexible. It was designed to be real foundational, nothing extra that you need at this point. But it allows kind of additional integration. So we mentioned that product verification component of it. We bought a solution there called MetaLedger Product Verification. It's blockchain-based VRS provider. It has the most requesters in it currently. We bought that solution and are integrating it into Pulse. For product tracing, that's primarily going to be a regulator-led activity, getting that information. So different ways they can do it. I said there were 2 things that cost money. It's the next 2. It's authorized trading partner status. That's compliance with DCSCA, making sure the person you're transacting with or selling drug product or buying drug product from meets the requirements of federal law. And there's license checks, which if you think about this from a state compliance perspective, don't go away. We talked about how there are some components of the law that kind of the federal law come in and overrule the state law. That's by and large not touching anything that pharmacists have to deal with or pharmacies deal with at all. It's exclusively some of the wholesale components to some degree, and then the track and trace that states were trying to do that never got implemented for the most part. And then the last part, that contact information, ways to communicate. So the idea is sets up a platform where, yes, there's a profile, but we don't really ask you for anything that's proprietary or sensitive. We don't touch any of the transaction information that you have that exists. It's pretty low weight. We also don't ask for any money. And we leverage existing standards like GS1's standards for either lightweight messaging in product verification or for GLNs and GTINs, things like that. And then we also harmonize the regulator standard. A lot of times we talk about like an industry standard, and if we can get it adopted, I know that that's always a problem. And if we think about standards and adoptions, there's kind of always 2 options, at least in my mind. On one hand, we have the open, like, We'll go create the standard, will be consensus-based, and from there it'll raise up through an entity like GS1 or something along those lines, and then we'll just hope everyone adopts it. And then we'll just encourage it, and hopefully it'll get there, and it won't go to the Betamax way, it'll go the VHS way, right? The other option is the scenario where a regulator just says this is the answer now. So that's the example of a DEA, and it's coming in saying you have to deal with something, and here's what the answer is. The downside to that is 20 years from now, we'll be still using Betamax, right? And so we found ourselves in a unique position where we were probably in the middle, where we probably had enough neutrality to be able to come in and say, hey, here's the thing, use it or don't use it, but it's going to hopefully solve a bunch of problems for you. And then as far as adoption goes, we just want to make sure there's no barriers to adoption. It's really, really easy. And ultimately, I know that we have not yet launched. As soon as we do launch, there are going to be people who say things like, you should go use this per state regulator, right? Things like that probably occur at some point in time afterwards. Not a requirement under the law. I'd be shocked if some states didn't encourage people to sign up. It also allows identity validation. We talked about that briefly. That's one component, especially in the indirect trading partner relationships, where figuring out is the person who they say they are. How do you extend that out? This allows for that and gives a platform that's kind of universally accessible, if not universally adopted. And so here's that model that Mark shown before, where it kind of has the supply chain here. Now regulators can make requests anywhere along these lines and get those answers, and they can build that breadcrumb trail. And then we'll help them on the back end actually facilitate that by giving them the ability to show the chain. And I'll go through and show a proxy example for that as well. Also, any questions while we're going through this? Because if there are, please let me know. I do better with a hot bench. Okay. So I'm going to jump to the demonstration real quick.
I guess while Justin's pulling that up, I think one thing to throw in there was accreditation is something NABP does. So they actually go into pharmacies and distribution centers. So they actually have inspectors on the ground. So that was critical to the whole identity thing, to be able to say, yeah, our NABP knows who they are for a big chunk of the supply chain. So I just want to mention that.
Yeah, it's a good call. For dispensers, I think we have 57% of all facilities, including everyone in the room, under an accreditation program, based on that number. So walking through this platform. So as I said before, it's Facebook meets phone book. It's really Mickey Mouse technology. We try to keep it as simple as possible. I come in here, I'm a user, I can go ahead and search. And so I can look up any pharmacy in the US. I know there's one on Las Vegas, right? There's one on the Boulevard. Let's see. Yeah, so I think this is the one that's down the street from here. So here's the profile. I can come in here. If I look up their license, I can click this button. I can check for it again. The only two paid features I'm going to show you right now. I can check the status of it. 40 cents I just spent, and now I can see that the person, this alleged entity, has a license and is in good standing. I know that because we get all of our data from primary sources, and we update that weekly. We promise it 2 weeks. If it's more than 2 weeks, it's free. We have a Domino's guarantee. And then up here in the top, we talk about ATP status a lot. The profile I'm looking at has not been claimed. I will just flag that. So if I go to check the ATP status, it'll tell me an unverified identity. And here it'll say, although this profile has been authorized as a dispenser under DCSCA, it hasn't completed identity validation. So if you have a relationship and you're selling to this entity or this location as a distributor, and you already know they are who they say they are, then the only question is who they say they are good enough to do business with? The answer is yes, right? And you're good to make that decision. We always want to give as much information as we have available to help flow product. And then over here, you can kind of see not a whole lot of stuff, some basic profile information, nothing else. But this gives me an opportunity to show how you go claim a profile. So the first step of claiming a profile, assuming you don't exist under an accreditation program we already have, or that we already know who you are for some reason that's sound enough. We're in your facilities, we do inspections, we know who you are. Assuming that's not true, you're a stranger to NABP. You come over here, the question is, do you have an activation key? The follow-up question is, what's an activation key? So you say no. And we offer to mail a letter in the mail for free to your address on your resident state license because we have the information. Once you have that, it has an activation code, a PIN code. You go and put it in here and you can continue on. Again, when in doubt, low tech, think fax machine, right? So You go to set up your profile, and here's the information we ask for. We ask you, what business model are you in, right? In this case, it'd be a dispenser. Then we ask you, give me a contact for regulators to contact, give me a contact for trading partners to contact, and give me a contact for us to contact if we need to get a hold of somebody there. That's it, right? Baseline information. There's some optional contacts you could put in. So if you wanted to put in information about exception handling, what happens when drug shows up, but you haven't got the information yet and you have to deal with that, cool. Contact this person instead, or contact the general one if they didn't populate it, right? Things like that. If I click next here, A, you'll get a bunch of red things saying you didn't put in mandatory fields, but B, it would then ask me for the activation key, and then I'd be able to claim those profiles. So let me jump to a profile I've already claimed. So on our executive board, we only have regulators who are there. Shane Wendell is on this North Dakota Board of Pharmacy. He owns 12 pharmacies in North Dakota. I've already claimed his profiles on his behalf, so you can see some more information here. So on the first page here, you can also go in and set up anticipated interoperability dates. Do you plan on using VRS, the system? Yes, no, put in a date, decide when it is. No one cares on our end. It's not a compliance tool. It is more something along the lines of other trading partners want to know when they should start harassing you about sending data from transaction information and things like that. My answer is go check the date. If it's not that date, wait. They're doing with other things and they're getting ready for it. If it's past that date, then contact them, right? But there's a bunch of consultants who are doing a collection of activity trying to populate this data. The same thing is true of VRS. I told you before that you could populate those contact fields. Here's the regulator contact field. It's mine. It's not Shane's. It's a lie. But it's also private. So the only people who see this contact information are regulators and NABP staff. It's not shared with the trading partners in general. The trading partner general contact and the access request email account there is. We encourage everyone to use group email inboxes for those reasons as well. You can see the license checks again that exist here, and then the business identifier. So before we didn't show it on that last one, but here you can see we have all the GLN information that we have from GS1 that exists. Many dispensers have been enumerated many, many, many times by other trading partners. We know that on average, every dispenser and every DEA registrant who is a dispenser has 3.2 GLNs per facility. Those are the unique pieces of identifiable information that actually exist through the transaction. So that's going to be essentially your license plate on all your compliance documentation. My guess is you want it to be the same one throughout everything. So you can come in here and you can manage those GLNs and say, make this one my default sold to and shipped to, and then make these other ones unpublished. So when another trading partner comes in, they know to use this one for my sold to field or my shipped to field and my transaction information. We don't get rid of the relationship. So if you unpublish it there, you can still go in, search by those unique identifiers, find the profile that associates with that, and kind of reverse back into it. Likewise, as dispensers do this, we actually feed that information back to GS1 to help them reduce the redundancy that exists within the system. And that information is directly pulled from GS1. DEA number, we don't ever publish this, but if you had a DEA number for somebody, you could look them up, right? You could always go and request the information and go check from it. Same thing true with NCPDP number. If you had someone's NCPDP number, you could do the same thing. But what we publish here for those users in those instances to be able to do it. The other things, we let people network their profiles together. So in the entity, right now we're in the process of onboarding about 30,000 facilities. If we come in here and look at Shane's, he has 12. It's easier. And you can see he can kind of create a profile tree to network them all together. And then he can take bulk action across them so that if you have 9,000 or 2,000 stores or whatever the answer is, you can come in and set your contact information in bulk and make changes and things like that, or change your sold to GLN, things like those for the rest of the industry to know about. And the last feature that I'll show here before I jump over to the other part is identity validation. I talked about how do we do identity validation. We talked about either we know you because we know you already, we're in your stores, we're in your wholesaling facility. I think a dozen states require accreditation by us in order to get licensure as a wholesaler in their state. So it's pretty ubiquitous there as well. Once you have that and you've associated a pulse, if you will, with a profile, you can then back into it for all sorts of reasons. So here I can show that it's real crazy technology here. You can generate a code, and then that's the code right there. That's the example. It's a one-time use. You can copy and paste it. You can fax it. You can scan it. You can send it in an API query. You can turn it into a JOT and send it into an ATP credential, whatever you want to do, right? You put it there. You send it to somebody else. They copy it. They go through and check it, and it tells them, hey, whoever sent that to you has access to this profile. That's all. You still have to choose if you're doing business with them. You can still check to see if they're ATP status. But now I can extend that identity validation that I've already established when claiming that profile to anybody else wanting to demonstrate it somewhere else. So if I get a call, I'm a dispenser, and I go in, I'm Susie's Pharmacy in Kansas, and I go and call Novartis, also the name of my dog. And I call Novartis, and I say, hey, is this product legitimate or not? Is this product legitimate or not? The answer can be, well, I have no idea who you are. It's like, cool. Let me send you an identity validation code from Pulse. Awesome, cool, perfect. Let me check it. I'm good, right? That's a way just to extend that. And if they want to check if there's ATP status or their licensure or whatever components they want to do from due diligence perspective, we kick that over to let trading partners decide what level of what their risk tolerance is and where they want to be on it. Also, again, not one of the two features I already mentioned costs money. Those are free. So let's show a utilization of this from a regulator perspective. So I'm a regulator, and I've went into a pharmacy, and I might have a tablet, or I might have a laptop, or I might have my phone, and I scan a product, and I get that 2D data matrix, right? And so I go and I scan that product, and I pull up the information that's on it. So I have that serial number, the GTIN, the lot, and the expiration directly from that data matrix. I then can populate the collection of the rest of the fields here from the NDC directory or other things that we already know about the manufacturer based on that information established. From there, I can say I'm going to submit a trace, because I'm going to do this as part of an investigation. I'm going to go in, some reason or another, maybe it's a funny color, which is the common example for all DSCSA-related things, or maybe more likely, I think the person upstream for you is not licensed in the state, and I'm going to take action and do an investigation. I can come in here, I can say what the reason is. These reasons are based on GS1's lightweight messaging standard. I have the information from that product that I already scanned, and I can start talking about who I'm going to send it to. So I can import the information for the manufacturer, which pulls from the Pulse profile for that contact information for that trace. And I can also search the Pulse profile itself on a collection of data fields. So I can have a collection of different profile attributes, and I can search any of those components right here. Once I do, I can submit the request, and it sends an email to them. And then I can manage it as a case file essentially on my end. If I look at a case file that already exists on this end, you can see that I'll be able to see the people who responded, and I can have follow-up responses. So again, putting together the breadcrumb trail or the chain of custody of ownership of this product. Not possession, but ownership potentially. Just a moment for the Wi-Fi. This is my last slide here that I need the Wi-Fi for, so if you could play. Okay, perfect. So you can see here in this example, they sent it to ABC Pharmaceuticals on Friday, March 22nd, and they received a response the same day, 6 minutes later, and then you say they sent it to DEF Pharmacy, and you can see these responses right here and here. So here, you can see the response here of I was the seller of it. The transaction date was February 1st. I sold it from ABC. I sold it to GHI. And then I come down here and see the other side of that breadcrumb trail. I received this from GHI, and I sold it to DEF, and DEF is the pharmacy I'm asking there. Then I can go back if I want and validate that by going and asking GHI, the distributor, and saying, hey, did you buy from ABC and did you sell to DEF? And once I've done that, it's actually much more secure than the transaction histories you currently have. Those could be doctored, those could be fraudulent, and the Biktarvy example that was shown before with the rocks, they had fraudulent transaction histories, real bottles, right? In this instance, you go to retrace this, and not everyone's going to lie together because then nobody's getting ripped off, right? So someone has to lie at some point, and it's going to become obvious when you ask other people around them. So with that, I believe that's the end of my slides. Let me do. Yep, and I'll turn it back.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll just summarize from the last part. So yeah, I think the important thing here is I know early on, I like to use the analogy of TSA pre-check versus regular check-in. As a pharmaceutical industry, when we were working on this early, a lot of people were really focused on TSA pre-check. They're like, we got to make this super fast, create digital credentials, do all these things. Nobody thought about the basic foundation building block. Like, how do we actually engage at the lowest technology standpoint? Because you have to do that first or you will get no adoption. So there's actually been some entities that have really kind of had a tough time. They've gone out and created digital credentials and done all this stuff, and they can't get adoption because they haven't figured out the foundational piece. So NABP is trying to create this platform so that as the industry evolves, Now they can start to tie onto this, right? They can say, hey, I've got a profile in here. I want to attach a credential to it to speed up some of these things. But that foundational part is important. The other thing is that NABP is already starting to explore this directory approach for other use cases. So one example is in Africa right now, huge problem with counterfeits around the world. Something like, I think it's like 20 or 30%, right, a product?
Yep, about 10 years ago it was 50%. Now it's about a third. Yep.
Yeah, a third of product in Africa is counterfeit. So it's crazy. So to be able to use this tool to help some of those entities as well. So yeah, I think we wanted to open up if we had any questions, I guess, right?
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes for questions. Just wait for me to bring you the mic so we can get you captured on the recording. You still need it.
Hi, Nick Hallis here. Thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. As part of your Pulse product, is there any future forward-looking towards using biometric authentication as opposed to a SMS or an OTP to make a more secure authentication journey, I would say?
Yeah, so let me tackle that in short. And the answer is if it had market adoption and people were using it 100%, right now we use Amazon's Cognito side of it, right? That's an easy side of it that was easy for us to deploy. What I would say that's tricky about this, where a lot of kind of identity validation components have broken down in these conversations, is that you want to identity validate the business, not the individuals, because the individuals come and go, but the businesses stay the same. So although you saw that I had a two-factor sent up for the phone, the profile is what houses all that data. The profile is what actually manages all of it. So if that employee no longer works there anymore, awesome. Kick them off the profile. Done. Easy, simple, right? The profile has all the data. The user doesn't have it. The user has a name, a password, a two-factor authentication, and that's it. Even payments, things like that, everything else for DCSCA compliance reasons needs to exist with the company and those attributes. So as long as you have one business user on there, you're okay. We even have systems in place. So if you want to essentially have like a work email and you got fired and you still had access and you no longer had access to it, but you weren't kicked off the profile, there are safety features in Pulse so that you can't leverage that email in other places. Of course.
Anyone else?
I guess I'll add one thing real quick. I don't think we really mentioned this, but in the pilot that we did, we actually worked with solution providers that are doing that data storage at the manufacturer, distributor, and pharmacy. So I think we had 14 that were a part of that pilot, and we there's a partnership program that NABP has called PIP.
The Pulse Interoperable Partner Program. There are lots of P's in it, but we have 17 companies in it. Some of them are traditional DCSCA solution providers. Some of them are licensing solution providers. The idea of keeping track of licensure for all the stores and things like that. Ultimately, we're going to run out a solution here for monitoring as well in the near future that allows for, hey, the license status change of your upstream trading partner or downstream trading partner, or one of your own stores if there's some issue there that the store itself sees it and has an issue but hasn't raised it to corporate. They have the ability to actually monitor.
All right, last chance for questions. All right, great. One more question.
Also, we'll be around afterwards. It's not actually your last chance.
Is it on the roadmap to allow like federation for login so that you could log in with your CVS profile, Walmart profile instead of just Pulse profile?
Yeah, so this is a tricky issue, and there's lots of good reasons for this being tricky. I think right now the more likely avenue we would approach for that, which we've talked about specifically, is going the other way and being allowed to use this as a single sign-on to other providers and systems that you already have to use somewhere else. So if you walk into most pharmacies, you will see all the way around their monitor where the pharmacist or technician sits, a collection of username, passwords, IDs, numbers, and things like that on Post-its stuck to the monitor. Right? It 100% exists. It's in every pharmacy I've ever worked in. And so the idea here is because we're offering this as a free, ubiquitous kind of component, that there's a possibility, and we've heard this from various entities as well, that they would be able to leverage the sign-in from Pulse into those other systems and replace those. So I think it's more likely that we go the other way around on it. But to your point, I don't think that's going to happen with like a CVS or a Walmart or a Walgreens login. I think it's more likely to happen with like a McKesson upstream trading partners login or some other state database.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. This was a really interesting panel. Before you all go, I just need to ask you, please, please, please go into the Identiverse app and fill out the session surveys. It really helps us get good quality content for you for next year.